Hi, I'm Miriam Lorie. I'm a Jewish educator based in London, and I'm absolutely delighted to be recording this week's Parsha blog for Yesod. So here we are in Parshat Bamidbar, in Sefer Bamidbar, in Bamidbar, in the desert. We've come to the Sinai Desert just to get a feel for what it might have been like for the people spending 40 years of their life in this landscape. So in this Parsha blog, I'd really like to get a sense of where the Jewish people is in this Parsha, in the arc of the whole Torah story so far. And we have readers' omniscience, don't we? We've read this book before and we know where we're going. So I want to give a shape of where we are in this arc, zoom into a few details, zoom back out again, and hopefully finish with a message which is resonant with us today. So we started off with Bereshit, the early human story, the beginning of humanity's relationship with God, the formation of a family who would come to have a relationship with the one God. And that family, their story continue in the book of Shemot. A people is formed from that family, and it's formed through collective oppression, through slavery in Egypt. And Shemot is such a great book because it's not just about the release of people from that slavery. It's not just about Exodus, as the English name would have you believe. It doesn't end with open-ended freedom, but it ends with a new structure, with the building of the Mishkan, with the rededication of the service of this slave nation, who once were forced to give their service to Paro, and now they freely give their service to their God, to Hashem. So that's Shemot. Then the book of Vayikra, which we finished last Shabbat, it spans just 8 days. And in those 8 days, the Mishkan is dedicated and worship begins. And now here we are in Bamidbar. We started this Shabbat, and it has a very different tenor. We're suddenly into the details of organizing this people to be ready for battle. In our Parsha, 3 different censuses take place. A camp is organized under banners for different parts of this people and where they're camping. There are repetitive lists which read more like ledgers than the Torah that we're used to. It's suddenly into the nitty gritty of, okay, how does this people function and how is it going to go forward and fight? Okay, so let's zoom in to look at one detail. Okay, so at the very beginning of this parsha, in Pasuk Bet, the second verse, we have this instruction from God to take a census of the whole Israelite community. And the Hebrew words are Se'u et Rosh Kol Adat B'nei Yisrael, which is curious wording. Se'u et Rosh literally means lift up the head of the whole people of Israel. And this wording reminded me of something else that happened way earlier in Bereshit, in Joseph's story. If you remember, Joseph was in prison with a butler and a baker, and he interprets their dreams. And the very punchline of his interpretation is as follows. Let's start with the butler. So Yosef says to the butler, Yisa paro et roshecha, v'hashivcha al kanecha. Pharaoh will pardon you and restore you to your post. So we've got the same words there, Yisa paro et roshecha. Literally, Paro will lift up your head, or as the Brits might say, chin up, or kind of restore your visage to what it was before. But then the baker gets a very kind of sickening version of almost the same words, and the irony going on in the literary structure is really powerful. So to the baker, Yosef says, Yisa paro et roshecha, et roshcha me'alecha. Pharaoh will lift off your head. He will lift your head from upon you. Off with his head, literally, decapitation. So these words, I think, tell us something really interesting about the phraseology of how to count the census. In other words, Nasa et rosh, to lift up the head, can mean to restore someone to greatness, or it can mean decapitation and death. And in some ways, it's similar when you're counting an army and forming an army. You're not just counting them, but you're counting on them. If they're in, the glory of the people is restored. If they don't show up, death. And I think a census has the potential to cheapen the status of the individual human. It's just kind of everyone's in the same boat, everyone is the same half shekel. We're just kind of pawns in a bigger system. But here it seems to be the opposite. Each person is counted on and each person is important and has a role. Now, I've heard some disappointing versions of that Devatora on this very Sedra, which say that if you count people, you show that they count, which is kind of what I'm saying, but with a slightly different nuance. I once listened to a rabbi deliver this sermon, completely oblivious to the fact that he was telling 50% of the people in the room, the women, that they don't count because women weren't counted in the census in this week's Parsha. But also others weren't counted. Levium, the Levites, they had their own separate census. People under the age of 20, people who are unable to bear arms, they also weren't counted. So I think we should be precise about this. This was a count for a specific purpose. They were counting fighting men, and that's okay. If you want an example of really including the entire nation, I think we should look at the end of the Torah, Devarim 31, where the entire people are gathered, men, women, old, young, from the most prominent in society to the most marginal, in an episode called Hakel et Ha'am. So if you want real inclusivity, a real example of bringing people together, look at the end of the Torah, not this point in Bamidbar. And there are sadly many examples of the confident start in Bamidbar going horribly wrong. The whole book of Bamidbar is a book of two parts. So at the start, the people are divided. They grumble constantly about their leadership. On a few occasions, they stage full-scale rebellions. And more catastrophically, the sin of the spies, which proves to God that this people is just not ready to enter the land. They don't have the strength of mind, or to use a contemporary term, they don't have the growth mindset to go into the land that they've been promised. So like I said, the book of Bamidbar ends up being a book of two halves and two generations. We've got the first generation who arranged themselves with such bravado in this week's Sedra, only to all die in the desert. And it's only the generation after them who grow up without the mental barriers of their parents who are able to go into the land. In Parshat Bamidbar, the people hasn't arrived yet. And maybe, if it's not too controversial to say, God is also learning what the people are ready for. Just as God has unrealistically high expectations for humanity at the beginning of Bereshit, and it led to flooding and starting the world again, it's a little bit of a recap of that in Bamidbar. High expectations, and unfortunately this people has to die in the desert only to start afresh. So here we are in Parshat Bamidbar. We're poised at a learning moment for the Israelites. We're sort of in the awkward teenage years before the people blossom and are able to realize their future. And I find it comforting that even the Bnei Israel, fresh from their encounter with God at Mount Sinai, with God right there present in their lives, can still make mistakes, that sometimes it can still take years or even a whole generation to achieve change. Rome was not built in a day, and maybe more appropriately, Jerusalem was not built in a day. And it's similar, I think, with our own hopes and dreams, our own ambitions, which so often don't come to fruition as quickly as we want. Sometimes we need to look back a decade or two, or back 4 decades in the case of the Bnei Israel in the wilderness, to see that we've achieved progress. And I think progress comes not the way we plan, but it's the slower, more convoluted, more real route of progress that in the end matters. So I wish you all Shabbat Shalom, and have faith that your hopes and dreams, however long they take to come to fruition, will come. And sometimes it takes a long view, and that's where we are in this week's Parsha. Shabbat Shalom.